Nurse mocks a woman's labor pain, unaware that her husband controls the entire hospital. But first, remember to subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing incredible stories. The corridors of St. Andrew's Medical Center bustled with activity as nurses and doctors hurried between patient rooms, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Outside, a sleek black sedan pulled up and James Turner stepped out, offering his hand to his wife, Ellen. Clutching her swollen belly, Ellen winced as another wave of labor pain shot through her. James, ever calm and supportive, helped her into the hospital's main entrance. Inside, the receptionist glanced up with a professional smile. "Good morning, how can I help you?" she asked, noting Ellen's obvious discomfort. "We're here for labor and delivery," James responded, his tone steady and measured. The receptionist quickly called for assistance, and within moments, Nurse Julie appeared. Julie, a woman in her mid-40s with an air of authority and impatience, looked Ellen up and down. Her expression was tight, almost judgmental, as if she had seen this scene 100 times before. She forced a smile, though it lacked any warmth. "Follow me," she said curtly, leading the couple down a sterile hallway. As Ellen stumbled slightly, groaning in pain, Julie turned her head slightly. "First child?" she asked, her voice dripping with casual indifference. "Yes," Ellen managed between labored breaths. Julie snorted lightly. "You're going to have to manage that better, sweetie. You're not even fully in labor yet," she said dismissively. James's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, choosing instead to focus on supporting Ellen. They reached the labor and delivery suite, where Julie handed Ellen a gown and directed her to a bed with all the enthusiasm of someone checking in library books. "Change into this and get comfortable. The doctor will be here shortly," she said, turning on her heel to leave the room. Ellen, now visibly tearful, clung to James's arm. "Am I overreacting?" she asked, her voice quivering with vulnerability. "Absolutely not," James reassured her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. His voice was gentle, but there was a storm brewing behind his calm demeanor. "You're doing incredible." As Ellen settled onto the bed, James stepped outside, pulling out his phone. A passing staff member nodded at him deferentially, murmuring, "Good morning, Mr. Turner." James gave a slight nod in return, but said nothing. His mind focused elsewhere. He knew what needed to be done, but he would wait for now. James walked down the hospital corridor, his shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. His phone buzzed in his hand, and he glanced at the screen, a reminder for a board meeting scheduled for later that week. Normally, such meetings consumed his attention, but today, his focus was entirely on Ellen. Yet, as he turned a corner, his path crossed with Dr. Evelyn Carter, the hospital's chief administrator. "Mr. Turner." "Doctor," Carter greeted, her tone carrying both warmth and respect. "I didn't realize you'd be here today." James offered a tight smile, nodding. "Unplanned visit," he replied. "Ellen's in labor." Dr. Carter's expression softened. "Of course. Please let me know if there's anything we can do to make her comfortable." James merely nodded again, his mind preoccupied. As they exchanged brief pleasantries, a junior nurse passing by overheard the conversation. She paused, her brow furrowing. "Wait, Mr. Turner? As in James Turner, the hospital's—" Dr. Carter interrupted with a smile, lowering her voice. "Yes, but let's keep that discreet." The nurse's eyes widened, but she nodded, scurrying off with a mix of curiosity and nervous energy. James resumed his walk, heading toward the administration wing. Though he rarely involved himself directly in the day-to-day operations of St. Andrew's, his position as the hospital's largest stakeholder afforded him a unique perspective. He had long maintained that the best way to assess the institution's culture was by experiencing it as an ordinary patient or visitor. Stopping by a window overlooking the courtyard, James took a moment to collect his thoughts. He replayed the interaction with Nurse Julie in his mind, her dismissive tone, the lack of empathy in her demeanor. It wasn't the first time he'd observed such behavior in the hospital, and it always left a bitter taste. Another buzz from his phone pulled him from his thoughts. This time, it was a text from his assistant, Sarah. Sarah, do you need me to alert Dr. Carter about anything? Should I schedule a meeting with the nursing staff? James typed back swiftly. James, not yet. I want to see how this plays out firsthand. Just as he hit send, a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he saw Dr. Malcolm Reeve, head of surgery. James, good to see you, Dr. Reeve greeted, extending a hand. Malcolm, James said, shaking it firmly. I heard Ellen's here. Everything all right? She's managing, James replied, his tone clipped. Dr. Reeve, perceptive as ever, leaned in slightly. Something bothering you? James hesitated for a moment before responding. Let's just say I'm observing some areas for improvement. Dr. Reeve chuckled lightly. You've always had a sharp eye for detail. If there's an issue, I'm sure it'll be handled. James gave a non-committal nod. As Dr. Reeve walked away, James's phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ellen. Ellen. They're prepping me for monitoring. Still no real help from that nurse. James's lips pressed into a thin line. He sent a quick reply. James, I'll be back shortly. Stay strong. Sliding the phone into his pocket, James turned toward the elevator. His calm facade remained intact, but beneath it, a plan was beginning to form. If Nurse Julie's behavior was a reflection of deeper issues in the hospital, he intended to root them out. Starting today, Ellen lay on the hospital bed, her breathing shallow as the monitor next to her beeped steadily. Her contractions were growing stronger, and with each wave of pain, she clenched her fists tightly, her knuckles turning white. Julie re-entered the room, clipboard in hand, her expression neutral at best. Let's see where we are, Julie said, her tone flat as she adjusted the monitor. She glanced at the readings, then at Ellen, her lips curving into a tight smile that carried no real reassurance. How are you feeling, Mrs. Turner? She asked perfunctorily. Like I'm being ripped in half? Ellen replied through gritted teeth, her forehead slick with sweat. Julie chuckled softly, a sound that bordered on condescension. Oh, it's not that bad. Trust me, I've seen worse. You'll survive. Ellen bit her lip, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Can I speak to someone else? Another nurse? She asked, her voice shaking. Julie raised an eyebrow. Oh, come on, you're not serious. Switching nurses because of a little discomfort? I've been doing this for 20 years, sweetie. I know what I'm doing. Ellen turned her head away, blinking back tears. Her chest tightened, and for a moment, the pain of her contractions was eclipsed by the sting of humiliation. Before Julie could say more, the door opened, and James stepped back into the room. His presence seemed to ground Ellen, her hand instinctively reaching for his. How are you holding up? He asked softly, crouching by her bedside. She's managing, Julie interjected before Ellen could speak, her tone dismissive. James ignored her, focusing on his wife. Ellen shook her head slightly, her voice a whisper. She doesn't listen, James. She keeps saying I'm overreacting. James looked up at Julie, his eyes sharp. Could you give us a moment? He asked, his tone polite but firm. Julie hesitated, her gaze darting between the couple. Fine, she said, her voice clipped. I'll be outside if you need me. She exited the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. James turned back to Ellen, brushing a strand of hair from her damp forehead. I'm sorry, he said softly. You shouldn't have to deal with this. Let me handle it. Ellen clung to his hand. I don't want to make a scene, she murmured. James smiled faintly, his expression calm yet determined. You don't have to. Just focus on the baby. I'll take care of everything. Stepping into the hallway, James spotted the head nurse at the station nearby. Excuse me, he said, his voice carrying authority without raising it. Can I speak to you privately? The head nurse, a woman named Clara, nodded quickly. Of course, Mr. Turner. Right this way. They stepped into a small consultation room where James closed the door behind them. Clara, already aware of James's position within the hospital, looked at him with a mix of respect and apprehension. My wife is in labor, James began, his tone steady. And her nurse, Julie, has been dismissive and unprofessional. I'm sure you understand why this is unacceptable. Clara's eyes widened slightly and she nodded. I'm so sorry, Mr. Turner. I'll look into it immediately. I'm not asking for an investigation, James replied coolly. I'm asking for results. Replace her. Now. Clara hesitated but quickly nodded again. I'll take care of it, sir. I'll assign someone else to Mrs. Turner right away. As James returned to Ellen's room, Clara moved swiftly, intercepting Julie at the nurse's station. The two exchanged a terse conversation, during which Julie's face reddened visibly. She glanced back at Ellen's room, her expression a mix of shock and indignation, before grabbing her things and storming off. Back in the room, Ellen looked up as a new nurse entered. This one, a kind-eyed woman named Margaret, immediately exuded warmth and reassurance. Hi, Mrs. Turner, Margaret said with a gentle smile. I'll be taking over for Julie. Ellen's relief was palpable, and she squeezed James's hand. Thank you, she whispered. James kissed her forehead. Focus on the baby, he said softly. I've got everything under control. As the door closed behind Margaret, James's phone buzzed again. It was a text from Clara. Clara. Situation handled. Julie has been dismissed for the day. We'll review her conduct tomorrow. James stared at the message for a moment, his lips pressing into a thin line. He had handled the immediate issue, but something told him this was just the beginning. The night air in Ellen's room had grown quieter, broken only by the steady rhythm of her breathing as she rested between contractions. James sat by her side, his hand resting protectively on hers. Margaret, the new nurse, moved efficiently around the room, adjusting monitors and offering calm reassurances. Your wife is progressing well, Margaret said with a warm smile. The doctor should be in shortly to check on her. James nodded his thanks, his face composed, but his mind racing. The incident with Julie had left him unsettled, not just because of her behavior, but because it hinted at deeper issues within the hospital. As he mulled over these thoughts, his phone buzzed once more. It was a message from Sarah, his assistant. Sarah, Dr. Carter has been informed. She's asked if you'd like to escalate this to a formal review. James typed back quickly. James, not yet. I need to address this myself. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, he stood and leaned over Ellen. I'll be back in a moment, he said softly. Just need to step out. Ellen opened her eyes briefly, offering a tired but trusting nod. James left the room, his steps purposeful as he headed toward the administration wing. When he arrived, he found Dr. Evelyn Carter waiting for him outside her office. She looked composed, but concerned. Mr. Turner, she greeted, motioning for him to follow her inside. Once the door closed behind them, James didn't waste time. I need to understand what's going on here, Evelyn, he said, his voice calm but firm. Julie's behavior toward my wife was unacceptable. How often does this happen, and what are we doing about it? Dr. Carter sighed, taking a seat behind her desk. James, I won't make excuses. Nurse Julie has had complaints before, but nothing formal enough to warrant serious action. She's experienced, but I admit her bedside manner has been lacking. James's expression didn't waver. Lacking? She dismissed my wife's pain and made her feel humiliated. That's not a lapse in bedside manner. That's a failure of our standards. Dr. Carter hesitated before nodding. You're right, we've become complacent in some areas. I'll make this a priority, starting with a full review of Julie's conduct. James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "It's not just about Julie. I want a comprehensive evaluation of how we're training and supervising our staff. St. Andrews has a reputation to uphold, and this kind of behavior puts it at risk, not to mention the trust of our patients." Dr. Carter nodded again, scribbling notes on a pad. "Understood. I'll assemble a team to start this immediately." As James left the office, his phone buzzed once more. This time it was a call from Dr. Malcolm Reeve, the head of surgery. "James," Malcolm began, his tone cautious, "I heard about the incident with your wife. I also heard you were stepping in directly. Everything all right?" "For now," James replied curtly, "but I'm not letting this slide. If this is happening to Ellen, it's happening to other patients too." Malcolm hesitated. "You're planning something bigger, aren't you?" James's silence spoke volumes. As he returned to Ellen's room, he found her resting more peacefully. Margaret greeted him with a smile, updating him on Ellen's progress. Everything seemed calmer, but James knew the storm wasn't over. Later that evening, as Ellen slept, James sat by the window, staring out into the city lights. His phone buzzed again, another message from Sarah. "Sarah, Clara has spoken with Julie. She's been put on probation pending further review." James replied, "James, good. Schedule a meeting with the board. I want to discuss broader changes to patient care standards." Sliding his phone into his pocket, he glanced back at Ellen, her face serene despite the day's ordeal. The hospital, his hospital, had failed her today. But James was determined to ensure it wouldn't fail anyone else again. Unbeknownst to him, the next morning would bring revelations he hadn't anticipated, ones that would reshape not just his role, but the entire hospital itself. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the blinds in Ellen's room, casting warm streaks across the walls. She stirred, her contractions easing momentarily as the doctor entered to check her progress. James sat at her side, his hand resting protectively on hers. Both looked up as Dr. Patel smiled kindly. "Good news," Dr. Patel said. "You're ready to start pushing. Let's meet your baby." Ellen's face lit up with relief and anticipation, her earlier discomfort momentarily forgotten. James kissed her forehead. "You've got this," he said softly. As the delivery team assembled, the atmosphere in the room shifted from tension to focus. Margaret and the other nurses moved efficiently, their professionalism and empathy stark contrasts to the previous day's ordeal. Ellen pushed through her labor, encouraged by the gentle coaching of the team, and at last, the sound of a newborn's first cry filled the room. "It's a boy!" Dr. Patel announced, holding up the tiny, wailing infant before placing him on Ellen's chest. Tears streamed down her face as she cradled her son, James's arms wrapping around them both. For a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. But as the initial joy settled, James's resolve to address the hospital's failings returned. He excused himself, giving Ellen a reassuring smile. "I'll be back soon," he promised, his voice steady with purpose. James's steps were brisk as he made his way to the conference room, where the hospital's senior staff, including Dr. Carter and several board members, had already gathered. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The rare appearance of the hospital's largest stakeholder carried weight. Dr. Carter stood as James entered. "Mr. Turner," she began, gesturing to a seat at the head of the table. James didn't sit. Instead, he placed his hands firmly on the table's edge, scanning the room. "Yesterday, my wife was admitted to this hospital in labor," he began, his tone calm but commanding. What should have been a moment of care and support was marred by unprofessionalism and negligence. Several staff members exchanged uneasy glances. "Nurse Julie's behavior toward my wife was unacceptable, but she isn't the core issue," James continued. "She's a symptom of a larger problem, a culture that has allowed complacency to creep in. That ends now." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression grave. We've already started a review of Julie's conduct as well as broader staff evaluations. That's a start, James acknowledged, but we need more than reviews. St. Andrew's prides itself on excellence. That means treating every patient, regardless of status, with dignity, empathy, and professionalism. I intend to make this a personal priority. A board member cleared his throat. And how do you propose we address this, Mr. Turner? James's voice grew firmer. First, comprehensive retraining for all staff on patient care standards, emphasizing empathy and communication. Second, establishing an anonymous feedback system for patients and families to report concerns without fear of dismissal. Third, quarterly evaluations of staff performance, not just on clinical skills, but on their adherence to our core values. The room was silent for a moment before Dr. Carter spoke. Those are ambitious changes, but necessary. I'll start drafting an implementation plan immediately. James nodded. Good. And I'll be personally involved in overseeing these efforts. It shouldn't matter who I am. Every patient deserves respect, Julie. Her face reddened, but she nodded. You're right. I let my frustration get the better of me. I'll do better. James's expression softened slightly. You'll have the opportunity to prove that, but this is your last chance. Julie swallowed hard and nodded again before walking away. That evening, James returned to Ellen's room, where she rested with their newborn son. The tension of the previous day had given way to a sense of renewal. James gently lifted the baby from Ellen's arms, cradling him with care. What's his name? Margaret asked as she checked Ellen's vitals. Ellen smiled, glancing at James. We've decided on Henry, she said softly. Margaret beamed. A beautiful name for a beautiful boy. As James looked at his wife and child, a sense of purpose filled him. His family deserved the best care, as did every patient who walked through St. Andrew's doors. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was determined to see it through. For James, the birth of Henry wasn't just the start of a new life. It was the beginning of a better future for the hospital and its patients.